How to play Necrons 8th edition. What is the playstyle of Necrons?
Necrons!
The flesh is weak, your walls will be mine. Necrons! 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 Necrons!
Nick speaking, and welcome to this video. Right, in today's Necron video we are going to talk about the playstyle of Necrons and how to play Necrons in 8th edition. Before that though, if you would like to keep up to date with the wonders of Warhammer 40k, not miss a Necron upload, then please subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss a video. Okay, so Necrons in 8th edition, how do we play them? Now this video has been inspired by a comment that I had from Mr. Ricardo6, and his comment was this. Hi Nick, can you do a video about the playstyle of Necrons? I simply cannot understand their way of playing. They are not a great shooting army, they are not very tough, and they are not a melee army. You have a lot of experience with Crons, so what are your thoughts?
Necrons!
Well, Ricardo, you are absolutely correct. I do have a lot of experience playing Necrons. Over 15 years. I've been playing them since around the middle of 3rd edition. I've played them in all the editions since, and I've seen Necrons change on the table. However, your question, I thought, was very relevant and worthy of a video. Okay, so first of all, a little backstory. So when I started playing Necrons, I remember Necrons were actually a pretty powerful army. They were very, very good at shooting. Their guns had special gauze weaponry, and with the rule sets at the time, those weapons were pretty devastating against tanks. Indeed, I remember when I said to my buddies that got me into the game that I'm going to choose Necrons as an army, I remember they rolled their eyes. One was an Imperial Guard player and the other one was a Chaos Space Marine player. And when I started playing the army, I did literally blow tanks off the table pretty easy. I remember an Imperial Guard army losing 4 or 5 tanks in turn 1 from my Necron gauze weapons. However, that was back in 3rd edition, and as the editions changed, sadly our codex didn't. I had my army codex for 10 years before I got an update. I believe we were in 6th edition when we finally got a new codex, and the codex creep happened. By the end of that 10-year period, it was very difficult, almost impossible to win with that codex. I was able to draw, but winning was very difficult. Necrons just weren't as powerful with the codex creep that happened around them. And to be fair, even with the new codexes that came out after that, I don't think that Necrons have been as powerful as they were back when I first started. Now it's fair to say, if you were picking an army to go to a tournament to win with, it's unlikely you would pick Necrons to do that. Necrons can be competitive, Necrons have some great army builds, however they're not necessarily a top tier, almost auto-win army. There is a lot of work needed to make Necrons win on the table, but they definitely can win. Now in your comments you say that Necrons aren't the greatest at shooting. Now it's fair to say they're not a gun line army. They don't have the range to be a gun line army, with most of the guns being 24 inches, with the exception of a few. We don't have too many high strength guns either, and the high strength guns that we have are very random in their damage output. So I totally get where you're coming from when you say Necrons aren't really a shooty army. Now if you ask a non-Necron player what their view is of a Necron army, what type of style is it, I'm pretty sure they would say it's a shooting army. But in reality, you are correct. Having said that, they are definitely better than they have been previously. They're almost as good as when I first started playing. Not quite, but almost. They do have some great options now with the new codex. Things like Tesla in the right dynasty, -1 on the Tesla, some of the stratagems that we have, my will be done buffs, etc. They can actually be quite a decent shooting army, but they're not the powerhouse of shooting. Now you also mentioned that they're not a close combat army. and once again they're not. They can do close combat. I've proved that with my Assault Necron list. However, they're not the best at Assault, and they definitely can be outclassed. Now you also mention they're not that tough, which is quite an interesting thing to say because Necrons are supposed to be the resilient army. Now that doesn't necessarily mean they've got high toughness. Now I remember the days when Immortals were elites and they had toughness 5. They were much better then. However, we are toughness 4, which is the same as most Space Marine armies for our ground troops. Admittedly, I think some of our vehicles are lacking in their toughness. Toughness 7, toughness 6, they don't cut it in 8th edition too well. Ideally you need to be toughness 8. That is the sweet spot. So all 3 things that you've said there are actually spot on. They're not the greatest shooting army in the world, they're not the greatest assault army in the world, and although we do have reanimation protocols, they're not necessarily the toughest army in the world. So how do we play Necrons? What is their playstyle? Okay, so some may say that Necrons are a boring army to play. They're just robots that plod up the table shooting their guns. Personally, I like that. I like the style and I like the theme of Necrons. And of course, as I said, I have been playing Necrons for a very long time. Now, back in the old days, we had a special rule where if you lost 75% of your army, the other 25% of your army phased out. Your army disappeared. Not good if you want to avoid tabling. Now that was a big hindrance on the army and it predicted our playstyle on the table. Primarily, yes, we were just blobs of warriors, immortals, a little bit of an assault element with wraiths and tomb spiders. A monolith was our only tank, and a great tank it was back then. We didn't have too many options on the table. It was quite a limited army in terms of what you could take. However, that did work back in those days, just having your units on the table, pushing forward, shooting your guns, taking objectives. Missions were different back then, as were the armies that we faced. And I think Games Workshop have tried to bring Necrons up to date with the new characters that we've had, and now with the new stratagems, with the warlord traits. There's definitely a lot more flavour to Necrons. However, Necrons just don't seem to have found their spot on the table. And I have to be honest, I don't think they ever will. Games Workshop could solve Necrons quite easily. They could make Necrons a really good Tau equivalent shooting army. All they had to do was make our guns a little bit better. Our destroyer guns 36 inches, our heavy destroyer guns 48 inches, and our heavy weapons, which we don't have that many, not to make them have a random amount of damage, having them as a fixed amount of damage, or at least do a minimum amount of damage. Those type of changes would really help Necrons, plus something for Gore's weapons where on a 6 you do a mortal wound. Those type of changes could easily have been done and would make Necrons much better at shooting and make them a top tier army. However, that isn't going to happen, and I can understand why. Necrons aren't the most popular army yet, although I am trying to make Necrons more popular. Let's face it, they're not Space Marines. They're never going to get as much love as some of the other armies. Okay, so we've worked out that Necrons are a jack-of-all-trades army. They do a bit of shooting, they do a bit of assault. But even if you dedicate that army to shooting, or you dedicate that army to assault, they're not necessarily the best. In a competitive environment, they're not necessarily going to overpower your enemy. You're not going to get a turn 1 or turn 2 win with Necrons. They do have some very nice combos, which we've previously talked about and we'll talk about more in the future. However, Necrons are a jack-of-all-trades army, and there's only one way to win with a jack-of-all-trades army, and that is to play the mission. Now, of course, everyone has their own opinion, so I'm going to share my opinion of playing Necrons, but I'd love to know what you think. Let me know in the comments box below if you agree with what I'm saying or if you disagree. And if you disagree, why not share how you play Necrons? Okay, so when your army doesn't excel at one thing on the table, when you can't take advantage of one style of play, then what you have to do is you have to play the mission. Now of course it's always good to play the mission anyway, but I think with Necrons it's even more important to play the mission. And we are talking a serious amount of mission playing. I'm not talking about waiting until turn 3, seeing how the game is going and then working out how you're going to win the game. You need to be focusing on winning the game way before that, even from the list building stage. You want to be an active player rather than a reactive player. You want to know what you're doing on the table, take control of the game and make your opponent react to what you're doing rather than you reacting to what they're doing. And the best way to do that is to have a plan. Where you're going to put the objectives, how you're going to take the objectives, how you're going to distract your enemy, how are you going to deal with an enemy which is coming towards you with some big nasty stuff. Those are the type of things that you need to plan before the game begins. In that way you can be an active player. But it's not all about having a plan. There is also a psychological factor when it comes to playing Necrons.
Necrons!
Okay, so we have our battle plan on the table, and of course the missions do change from game to game, and that is why we need to adapt at the beginning of the game. When we find out the deployment zones, when we find out where the objectives are and also what our enemy has on the table, these are the times that we really need to have a think about what we're going to do on the table, and this is where you need that psychological element. So what I do is right at the beginning of the game is I try to visualize what the end of the game is going to look like. Let's say we've got 4 objectives on the table. I will try to visualize which objectives with which units I want to be standing on at the end of the game. Now, ignoring secondary objectives for now, if there's 4 objectives on the table, you don't have to take all 4 objectives to win. You only need 1 more objective than your opponent. So arguably you could give your opponent one of the objectives. No doubt he has an objective in his deployment zone which he's probably sitting on, which means you only have to take 2 objectives yourself. The other objective can be just cleared with no one holding it. So what I would do is I would visualise which units I want to take those 2 objectives. Let's just say I've got 2 units of Immortals. Let's say the objectives are in terrain. I have a good chance of having those Immortals by the end of the game sitting in terrain with a 2+ cover save, taking those 2 objectives. I would then work out how I'm going to deal with that 3rd objective. I'm going to ignore the objective that my opponent's on. I'm going to look at trying to clear the other one. Now I may have some fast moving units like Wraiths or Tomb Blades. Potentially I can take that 3rd objective. Of course I would try, but I know that all I have to do is clear it rather than taking it to win this game. Now of course secondary objectives come into effect. First blood has to be the most important one because it's the one that we can't share. So you have to be very mindful of first blood. If you lose first blood and your opponent gets it, you know that you are going to be 1 point down. Definitely keep a tally of the points that your opponent's scoring and what you're scoring and what you need to win the game. Do you need line breaker? Have a look at your opponent's army. Are they going to get line breaker? If it looks like they're not going to get it, all of a sudden you have a chance to get that first blood point back to even the battlefield and slay the warlord, a very important point. If it looks like your warlord is going to be vulnerable, even though he may be quite good in assault, it's sometimes not worth risking that point, depending on the mission parameters, the situation of the table. And this is where the psychological side comes in. So I now know which 2 units I want to take my objectives, also know which couple of units I'm going to need to maybe steal or clear an objective at the end of the game, maybe get a line breaker. Once I've determined where my units that I want left on the table by the end of the game are, I then know that the rest of my army is totally disposable. Now that can be quite difficult to get your head around. Of course you know that you are going to lose some units during the course of the game, but if you have the mindset that you can lose pretty much 80% of your army and still win the mission because you know how you're going to win the mission before the game begins, That is quite powerful to be in that position. Now of course you don't want to waste your units. You're not going to just throw them up and just let them die. You need to be quite strategic in how you're going to do it, to the point that the objective that you've already decided in your head that you're going to let your opponent have it, you still need to make a play as if you were going to get that objective. Make your opponent think that you're going out to get that objective. That will distract him from your mission objectives. He thinks, hey, he's going to come over here, he's going to try to get this objective, I better surround it a bit more, maybe put an extra unit on it, maybe siphon this unit over to that objective. I want to protect it, it's my objective. So yes, you could send in a unit of wraiths, maybe deep strike in some death marks, make a play for that objective, but not with the intention of actually trying to take it, but with the intention of trying to make your opponent think you're going to take it. In the meantime, you have a much bigger plan for winning the mission. Now of course things do change during the course of the game, and you have to take into account what your enemy is doing. Are they going to deep strike in towards your backfield where your objectives are? If so, you may need to put extra supports there. Maybe a ring of scarabs around your immortals. Maybe you need to hold back a unit of wraiths as a counter assault. So you definitely are going to have to adapt. But 100% the way to play Necrons is just to play the mission. Don't necessarily think, how much of my enemy's army am I going to be able to kill? Am I going to be able to kill Magnus? Don't worry about what you can kill on the table. Worry about how you're going to get the mission points. It is a different mindset, it is a different way to play the game to just plonking your army on the table and killing your enemy in 1 or 2 turns. With Necrons, that is highly unlikely to happen. However, they do have some great attributes. They are survivable with RP, but remember, you don't need the whole army to survive. Don't be afraid to push units forward, to lose units. As long as you have that battle plan, as long as you know how you're going to take objectives, then you can definitely win with Necrons. So that's what I've learnt over the years, and I really hope you found that interesting and maybe useful. And if you did enjoy this video, please consider subscribing. Hit my icon at the end of the video so you can keep up to date with the wonders of Warhammer 40k. Beam me up!